centrality of the sea, the organization of the sea, of trade through the sea, the management of resources from ships to the making of Western modernity from 1600 onwards. And here we can find at the same time, for example, the industrial, thinking about Herman Melville's novel, Moby Dick, which is all about the industrial logic and organization of whaling, the industrial use of the sea as a resource, which also reveals at the same time its proximity to the industrial organization of enslaved bodies in the slave ships carrying slaves from West Africa to the Americas. So we might talk about the monstrous coordinates of modernity in this maritime example, from the slave ship to factory labor, from the slave ship to factory labor. Here at the same time, we also encounter the resistance, as has already been mentioned, the resistance in the counter-histories of slaves, sailors, and pirates in the revolutionary Atlantic that Marcus Rediker talked of in the first Hydrarchy meeting in September 2010. Now, in the wake of Herman Melville's and Joseph Conrad's vessels or ships, but also in the wake of the slave ships tacking or moving back and forth between Europe, Africa, and the Americas on Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, the sea narrative questions not only its own foundations, being at sea, being based on unstable foundations, questions not only its own foundations, but also reaches beyond itself to question the foundations of a world that for several centuries have been run in all sorts of ways from ships. From those ships we saw Nelson's ship, Nelson's fleet in the Bay of Naples, or in Egyptian waters, defeating the French, or the whaling ships, or the slave ships. The centrality of it. So folding modernity back upon itself leads to the questioning of these foundations that are based purely in territorial reference, or territorial point of view. At the same time, if the sea has been is predominantly framed by European desire and sexed by the male gender, these are all men, right? The whalers, the slave ship owners, Nelson, and so on. At the same time, it is also a space, as Monica Centani has argued, that hosted those we find at sea, in the sea, those such as Polyphemus, Medea, and Calypso, Caliban and Sycorax, all who have spoken of reasons that are inexpressible in the rationale of the Logos that triumphs in the Occident. The language that frames the world always remains susceptible to appropriation, by monsters, slaves, blacks, women, and migrants. That is, by the excluded who speak of overlooked, unexpected, displaced, and non-authorized matters. Today, that mythical Mediterranean, Sycorax and Caliban and Medea, that mythical Mediterranean is brutally vernacularized in the fraught and dramatic journeys of anonymous men, women, and children migrating across its waters. What happens every night in the Mediterranean? People seeking to enter fortress Europe. Caliban returns, Shakespeare's drama The Tempest. Caliban returns as an illegal immigrant, and Prosperous Island, midway between Naples and Tunis, in Shakespeare's 16th century drama, becomes modern-day Lampedusa. And here, this is an installation that some of you may know, may be aware of, by the black British artist Isaac Julian. It's an installation projected on 3 screens, which talks about the question of so-called illegal migration across the Mediterranean. Western Union small boats, Western Union being the agency that migrants use to send money back home, small boats being the the small vessels that migrants use to seek to cross the Mediterranean. So we are invited to step offshore for a moment and consider inherited, the way we think about history, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about belonging, to think about these references from elsewhere with unstable foundations, and to think about them also through other eyes. For example, that of a desperate vision of a modern-day migrant riding the waves in a small boat, gazing hopefully northwards. Here, the migrant's time becomes the migratory or the migrating time of modernity. It's not just a social or an economical phenomenon. It's a real political, cultural, and ontological challenge to our understanding of time and belonging. Here, the migrant's time becomes the migratory time of modernity. The distant shore and the marginal world, that is us or me, looking south from Europe, the distant shore and the marginal world that is hidden and ignored becomes immediate. It's there on the migrant's body, the body I encounter in my space, my city, my culture, my territory. So this distant shore and marginal world is literally figured and exposed by the body of the feared foreigner, the despised stranger. Like a nemesis, the interrogating presence of the migrant arriving from the sea announces planetary processes that are not merely mine or ours to manage and define. Planetary processes that are not merely ours to define. He or she, the migrant, draws Europe and the West to the threshold of a modernity that exceeds itself. Somebody else's modernity. Spoken, lived, expressed differently, with a difference. Still within modernity, but not necessarily my understanding or my version of it. The migrant's time creates a slash in my time, a cut in my time, through which modernity itself migrates. Modernity migrates and then returns, bearing other histories, other modalities of narrating the modern world. For the migrant is not merely the historical symptom of a mobile modernity, rather she is the persistent and condensed interrogation of the true identity of today's planetary political subject. At the end of the day, his or her precariousness, the precariousness of the migrant, is also ours. For it exposes the coordinates of a worldly condition in both the dramatic immediacy of everyday life and in the arbitrary violence that is sustained in the abstract reach of the polity or the politics of politics and the law. Who is a citizen, who is not a citizen? Who can be here, who should not be here? The arbitrary violence of the state and the law. Citizenship is not a permanent condition for everybody. It's not a permanent condition. It is a precarious one. A precarious one in an always incomplete state. Ultimately, it's the contemporary migrant and her clandestine histories or illegal, unrecognized histories who reopens the archive, ushering a colonial past into the present, announcing the return of the repressed, simultaneously drawing us back while propelling us forward into Europe's violent heart of darkness and a negated colonial past veiled behind the screens of progress. All this bursts out of the frame. All this comes rushing out of the past into the present to interrogate us. Now, we're now going to see a video sequence. We've put together two videos. I've run them together. One, we will see a short sequence from the famous dance scene in Luchino Visconti's film, Il Gatto Pardo. And then we'll see another dance done by migrant bodies in the same space. This space is Palazzo Gangi in Palermo. And so what we see is other bodies, other histories crossing the same space, repeating that space to propose another set of histories that can emerge from it. And I think this is quite central to understanding what I would call the post-colonial aesthetic, that is repeating modernity, repeating what is available in modernity to release another history, a history that is unsuspected to the hegemonic version of modernity itself. So what we have here is the same space crossed by other bodies and histories. This is, according to Salman Rushdie and Homi Bhabha, this is how newness enters the world. It's the same logic as that of a disc jockey. Pieces already available, 2 discs, sounds already available, mixing them together to create a sound, a rhythm never heard before. Using the available to create the unexpected and the unsuspected. So we have here modern migrants and the return of the repressed, the repetition of the archive that produces a further unsuspected critical space, both ethically and aesthetically.